Hello, my name is Darlene Sousa Anderson. I'm the Vice President of EHS Services at ChemAdvisor, a UL company, and I, along with Elizabeth Cahill, will be presenting information on regulatory impacts for 2018. So here are your New Year's regulations. So we're going to be focusing on, in this presentation, some deadlines for GHS, Chemical Control. We're also going to be referencing if there's any drafts that we feel are going to be upcoming in 2018. And finally, we're going to talk about any regulations that we expect to be finalized in 2018. We're going to be covering the world. So we're going to start off with Europe and Eurasia, move into North America, Central and South America, and finally wrap up with Asia Pacific. So let's get started with Europe and Eurasia. So first we're going to mention some deadlines. So the Turkey REACH, formerly known as the KKDIK, the launch of the pre-registration window began in December 23rd of 2017, so just a few weeks ago, but we opted to include it here because that window is still open. Also, I think everybody is very aware that the REACH final registration deadline is upcoming in May of 2018, and these are for substances that are 1 ton or greater. And I'm sure everybody's been following ECHA statistics on this, and the amount of registrations that have been dedicated so far is much smaller than they anticipated. So we'll see what happens when we get closer to the deadline, whether there's a major influx of new registrations that come on board, or whether the supply chain will be damaged because of suppliers dropping out of the market once this deadline is reached. So this is one of those that we want to stay tuned. So more specifically, when we're talking about kind of what to pay attention to in this coming year, we're going to start with the European Union, and everyone probably is quite aware that the CLP regulation was first launched in December of 2008. And since then, there have been ATPs, or Adaptations of Technical Progress, issued in order to update or revise the initial regulation. So the 11th ATP is up next, and we actually had expected that to be published already in 2017, but that did not happen, so we expect it to happen at any time. So what's noteworthy in the 11th ATP, other than the normal revisions and additions and deletions and changes to Annex 6, is we expect the chemical names that are currently in Annex 6 to be available in all of the European Union official languages. So all the translations of the chemical names should be available, and this will be the first time, and that'll be a wonderful thing to have access to. Also noteworthy in the 11th ATP is the addition in the notes column of Annex 6, which is the last column, for 3 substances, the ATEs, or the acute toxicity estimates. And for those familiar with GHS, they will know that that plays a role in acute toxicity classification. So the screenshot is for the substance nicotine, and as you can see, it does reference ATEs for all routes of exposure here, inhalation, dermal, as well as oral. Along the lines with ATP, we are expecting the 12th ATP. Not sure whether that'll actually finalize in 2018 or not, but we do expect alignment of the CLP with GHS Revision 6. And just as a side note, for those of you that were around in 2008 when CLP was first published, it was against the second revision of GHS. So they've really done a nice job in keeping up with the versions of GHS. And by the way, the current version UN publishes is revision 7. Also noteworthy is REACH Enforcement Project number 6. It's going to focus on hazard classification and labeling of mixtures, so we're going to be quite anxious to see their findings on that. Don't know, again, if that's going to publish as final in 2018, but the hope is that it will. Also related to CLP, everyone is probably already aware of the new Annex 8 that got added late last year, where harmonization of poison center information was included. We expect guidance on the interpretation of that new Annex 8 to be published in 2018. And finally, for the REACH regulation, we expect some amendments to some of the annexes to include registration of nanomaterials. And again, the hope is that expectation that some, if not all of these, will be finalized in 2018. Also, in Sweden, and Sweden is a member of the European Union, there still is a requirement to register products that are manufactured or sold into Sweden via the Swedish Chemicals Agency product register. There's a new regulation that came into force January of 1st, 2018, requiring companies to include and identify whether nanomaterials were intentionally added to the products. There is a 13-month period to comply with this new requirement, so that final deadline won't be until 2019. For Switzerland, which is not a member of the European Union, a new version of the chemical ordinance is expected somewhat early in 2018 to address phase-in substances that are in Switzerland but aren't registered under REACH. Also, some changes in the regulation of nanomaterials and marketed intermediates is expected as well. And finally, for Europe, the United Kingdom, which is a part of the European Union, at least for the moment, they are exiting the European Union. I think everybody's quite aware of that and the challenges and complications that will provide. But just as a reminder, UK must develop a new framework for regulation of all kinds. We're very interested in the chemical regulation, of course, but just as a reminder, the EU law will cease to apply in the UK as of March 30th, 2019. And before we leave that part of the world, we want to mention Eurasia, specifically the Eurasian Economic Union countries, EEU countries, and the very last bullet on this slide shows the countries that are part of that union. So it's the Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Belarus, and Kyrgyzstan. And these countries border the Russian Federation, and loosely there's additional countries that used to be part of the USSR, United Soviet Socialist Republic, but some of those countries are part of the Eurasian Economic Union. So why are we talking about this? Well, back in 2017, in the first quarter, they did issue a technical regulation on the safety of chemical products, and this was signed in March of 2017. It was discussed for a great length of time, and everybody's quite happy that this finally got signed because this does impact classification and labeling of chemical products. There's quite a lengthy time for this to enter into force, not until June of 2021, but between now and then a lot has to happen, and we are expecting procedures for registries or inventories is another way to look at that, and notification of new chemical compounds. We expect that by the end of 2018, so we're really hoping that that does indeed happen. Moving on to North America, which includes Canada, United States, and Mexico. Everybody's probably quite aware that GHS has been implemented in all of these countries. Not all deadlines have passed, and we'll be discussing what those are here in a moment. And US and Canada have long-standing inventories under TSCA and SEPA with DSL and NDSL. And with the Lautenberg Act that was passed a year plus ago, there is efforts to update and improve. And even Canada is discussing ways to improve their chemical management through the use of inventories. Mexico's efforts haven't been on hold for a couple of reasons. A number of years ago, they did issue a draft inventory. It was voluntary. There was no regulatory needs associated with it or requirements, and really nothing's happened since then due to lack of funding. But also with the presidential election occurring in 2018 in Mexico, we don't anticipate much regulation to be issued. As far as bodies to watch, the U.S.-Canada Regulatory Cooperation Council, otherwise known as the RCC, that's been around since 2011, initiated under the Obama administration in an effort to harmonize efforts for regulatory cooperation between the two countries, and we're most specifically interested in their GHS harmonization efforts. So they continue to meet and continue to work on this very important effort. Also wanted people to be aware of the U.S. Hazard Communication Standard. We're past all of our deadlines. When it was published in 2012, it was against revision 3 of the Purple Book. It still is against revision 3. There has been no proposed rulemaking to update that. However, if you do ask OSHA, they will tell you that they are monitoring and will take action whenever necessary. So if you take a peek at their long-term actions, it still is on the list of long-term actions, so it hasn't completely dropped off the radar, but it's not anticipated to occur anytime soon because it's not listed on the semi-annual regulatory agenda. Was just published a short while ago. And as far as deadlines go for North America for 2018, we have quite a few. So for TSCA, the inventory reset deadline for manufacturers is February 7th, 2018, and jump down a few and we see the processor deadline is about 8 months later for October 2018. Also for Canada, we have multiple GHS deadlines under the Hazardous Products Regulation. For manufacturers, June 1st, 2018. For distributors, September 1st, 2018. And finally, if you jump down to the last bullet, December 1st, 2018 for employers. And the next last bullet is Mexico. The deadline for compliance with NOM 18 as issued by STPS in 2015 is October 19th, 2018. And basically this NOM deals with the classification and labeling requirements for products in Mexico. And just as a reminder, the National Inventory Project has been suspended or stalled due to lack of funding. And as we mentioned, with the presidential election in Mexico in 2018, we don't really expect to see a lot of activity in the regulatory area. And finally, we want to talk a little bit about some expectations for Canada in the coming year. We do expect, as far as the chemical management plan to go, that there will be a nanoscale prioritization project result available in spring of 2018. Nanoscales regulation seems to be quite popular anymore around the world. And finally, we did mention that there are some changes planned for the chemical management system. We don't know if they'll hit in 2018, but there was a report released in June of 2017 by the House of Commons urging CEPA, or the Canadian Environmental Protection Agency, to reform the requirements. And as a matter of fact, more than urging, they actually identified 87 specific recommendations for changes to the chemical management plan. The Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change issued a brief response in October 2017, simply reaffirming the changes are needed and proposals are expected to begin to be launched as soon as June of 2018. So that wraps up both Europe, Eurasia, and also North America. And we're going to turn this over to Elizabeth Cahill for finishing up the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Darlene. As Darlene mentioned, my name's Elizabeth Cahill, and I'll be taking you guys around some other regions of the world, again looking at what we expect to be going on in 2018. By talking about South and Central America, as an overview in this area, we see a lot of GHS developments. Those are mostly in draft phase or in discussion by working group phase. We haven't seen any inventories come to the table in this region yet. As we are seeing the changes that are going on in this area, and in particular the timelines, a relevant fact to consider is that the Mercosur countries of the common South American market are aiming to implement UN model regulations, especially on the transport of dangerous goods, and UN GHS in line with their 1991 Treaty of Integration. Additionally, the European Union provided support to Mercosur over a 6-year project, 2009 through 2015, and you can see that the region is reaping the benefits of these investments and intentions. 2018, two deadlines that it's important to be aware of. Costa Rica's GHS implementation of the past year comes into force with a deadline of January 1st, 2018. Relatedly, we've seen recently that Costa Rica's technical regulation on hazardous chemical product registration, import and control also enters into force in May 2018. The mandatory registration of all hazardous products in Costa Rica with the MinSalud, which is the Ministry of Health, will move over to using GHS SDSs in line with their transition to GHS for their safety data sheets and labels. And products that have been previously registered with the MinSalud will need to be re-registered in a transition period over the next several years. Additionally, in the spring of this year, we'll see a GHS deadline for Ecuador on February 1st. Moving through the rest of the region, Brazil's draft law of 2016 was issued at that point and has been discussed with a comment period and working group meetings throughout 2017. If put into force in its current state, based on the drafts that we've seen, it would create an inventory with registration requirements, as well as reporting GHS classifications in addition to the hazard communication framework that Brazil already has in place. Chile's recently issued regulations on the classification, labeling, and notification regulation was issued in November 2017, and the comment period is still currently open through January 12th, 2018. Chile already has GHS Revision 5 regulation in place since 2015, and we are investigating the implications of this additional regulation and how it will change the framework there. Colombia released the draft decree for implementing Purple Book requirements within the country back in 2016. In 2017, a second draft of that regulation was released. It contains requirements for update frequency on SDSs and describes a staggered transition period, but we'll wait and see the final version of that decree as it would be put into publish, and we'll be watching to see if that occurs in 2018. An additional hanging over piece from 2016 is a draft GHS regulation which Guatemala issued that would, in its form as issued in 2016, implement Revision 5 of the GHS. Moving on to the Asia-Pacific region, in this region is that many countries have implemented GHS already. Several countries do have inventories in place, and most have active chemical control laws. But what we see in contrast to the setup that we have in the European Union or in the United States is that the regulations are typically less consolidated. So whereas we might have regulations all gathered together under a system like REACH, where you have one place to go to and one place to track a lot of updates, we'll see more moving parts and more different pieces updated as we look at some of these countries. So to start with looking at the deadlines, first of all, a big deadline coming up this year is the first of the existing substance registration deadlines for Korea. So this was a 3-year period from 2015 through 2018. Korea's existing substance registration is staggered based on lists which identified which substances need to be registered when. So anybody whose substances were on that first set of lists, their deadline is coming up this year, June 30th of 2018. Additionally, as we've been looking at the Philippines GHS regulation, there is a noted deadline for 2018 for chemicals which fall under toxic chemicals listed by IATA and IMDG lists of dangerous goods. Within the regulation itself, it doesn't specify whether this is the beginning or the end of 2018, but notably in terms of its effects on you, there is already a department order from the DOLE that would mandate GHS for all industrial chemicals, and that's been effective since 2015. Another note here, not exactly a deadline that's in place over the next year, but the December 13th cabinet order for Japan, and this was just in the past weeks here in 2017, will make some changes to the Japanese chemical substance control law, including a change in how to calculate your tonnage and setting out a new category or definition for substances known as specified chemical substances, and there will be associated obligations to communicate through downstream users. Those changes take effect in this year and running into January 2019 of next year. Not precisely deadlines, but something to be aware of as you handle your related obligations for the chemical substance control law. So moving throughout Asia Pacific, there is a lot to keep your eye on as things are changing. In Australia, a multi-year effort towards NIC-NAS reform, which would affect your substance notification obligations. The reform is expected to be fully implemented by September 2018, so we will look for any additional guidance and intentions to be issued throughout this period. Additionally, Australia's provinces and territories made regulations which accepts GHS separately for each province and territory, a little bit like you would see in Canada also. So there is the Australian Capital Territory still remaining to have GHS implemented, and that regulation is expected in 2018. In China, we're anticipating that the safety requirements for hazardous chemicals in consumer products will be finalized in 2018, and once finalized, that would restrict 103 categories of chemicals from presence in consumer products. We are also keeping our eyes on a document guidance for new chemical substance notification from China based on their technical barrier to trade notification as submitted to the World Trade Organization in March 2016. Now, we've noted here for completeness India's draft law on chemical policy, which was drafted in 2012. We haven't seen movement on that since 2014, but it's worth keeping that in the back of your mind as we go forward, because if implemented as with its original intentions, that would implement a really broad chemical control scheme, which would mean a lot of changes for how we do business with India. In Indonesia, there are some differing translations of how we talk about the regulation of hazardous and toxic substances, so we've noted that's also referred to as poisonous substances. And within that, substance type B3 is expected to be changed how we define and regulate that. Within Japan, we're expecting more changes to the chemical substance control law this year. I noted some adjustments in how calculation methods are looked at and some new definitions, but substances which are on the inventory we're expecting to see changes as far as that this year. In Korea, we noted that there is a deadline, June 2018. We are also waiting to see whether the draft amendments for K-REACH that were circulated in June 2017 will be published this year. And then another chemical regulation that we need to be aware of that could possibly be finalized this year is Pakistan's draft rules from 2016, which would implement GHS. For Taiwan, we were watching at the end of December to see if the Phase 2 registration list would be published. This is expected now to be released in early January 2018. When that is published, it will set out which substances need to go through the next phase of registration in Taiwan, and along with that publication, the corresponding registration deadlines will be released. We are also watching the drafted amendments to the Toxic Chemical Substances Control Act the regulation of new and existing chemical substances registration underneath that would be changed by the amendment as released. And then for Taiwan, we have been watching out for the Department of Industrial Works inventory. We're expecting that to come in 2018. We're also anticipating to see a new list of hazardous substances, that would be list number 4, early on in this year, and that would reclassify the hazard types of some substances that are already listed. Thailand uses categories 1 through 4 to describe the hazard types of substances, as well as adding and removing several chemicals for this list. For Vietnam, we're watching their inventory too. We saw a second draft of that inventory become available in March 2017, and the feedback period from industry on that draft version is still ongoing. Finally, to wrap us up, we've summarized topics and where those deadlines fall over this next year in this infographic to show kind of the GHS deadlines occurring throughout the year, mounting together, and where those connect. So starting with Ecuador, GHS deadline, then you see February 7th with the US TSCA deadline, and we've linked that to the second deadline for you, and then showing the Canada staggered transition deadlines throughout the year for their GHS implementation too. We hope this proves useful to you as you plan your New Year's resolutions, keeping track of every regulation that you need to. Get in touch with us with any questions. Thank you.